Impact Teams Radio. Welcome to Impact Teams Radio, the show where we explore what it takes to be a leader of the leaders in corporate America. Get ready to be inspired and discover proven tips for going from average to exceptional. Now, here's your host and guide, Tony Sherman.
Hello and welcome to Impact Teams Radio. This is your host and guide, Tony Sherman. And this week we have a return guest in Howard Shore from the Activate Group. Howard, welcome back.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for joining us again. Now, for those of you who haven't heard Howard's earlier episode, I do ask you to go back and listen to it. There was a lot of teaching in that. And what we're going to do is use that as a foundation and springboard into a deep dive on some of the leadership stuff that Howard and I have been talking to over the past while. So, but Howard, just in case there's some people who are plugging themselves into this episode now and they don't know you as well, why don't we step back and ask you to share, say, a unique experience with our listeners so they can get to know you.
Awesome. So if you didn't hear my last call, you'd know that I have a 16-year-old son and a 13-year-old son, and I'm very, very family-oriented. And so the unique experience I want to share with you is a leadership experience, but it was caused by my older son when he was 5. He came to me one day, came home, and he brought me one of these pamphlets from elementary school and said, you know, Dad, I'm thinking about doing Cub Scouts. Can I do it? And I said, sure, son, that would be great. And I had done Cub Scouts for a very, very brief period when I was a kid, couldn't remember it, and figured no harm, no foul, whatever my son wants to do, I always go 100%. And so I show up to the very first meeting, and next thing I know, I walk out of there and I'm a den leader. And I was a den leader because no one else was willing to do it. And they're saying, don't worry about it. It's only going to be an hour a month. That hour a month was really 5 hours a month. And next thing I knew, very quickly, I went to the first camp out, and one kid's teeth got knocked out, his front teeth. It was chaos. The unit itself, the unit, they call it a pack, was not very organized. They didn't have stuff planned out very well. They didn't have very much leadership in terms of the parents helping. They had about 50 kids involved, but it was really just chaos. And so, unfortunately for me, because I had the leadership background, I got capped, and the next thing I know, I was the pack leader. And so for the next 4 years, I was the pack leader of this unit. And so the unusual experience for me was not only did I learn how to interact with my son differently, but you got to think it was pretty funny for a guy who doesn't go outdoors, is not a camper, is not very handy, is now running a Cub Scout pack that's all about outdoors and all about handiness and all about all these different activities. But what I was able to do in this experience was draw from all of my experiences, actually recruit leaders, get a lot of parents involved, leverage different parents in the pack, and we actually grew this unit from where it was 50 kids. By the time I got done with the pack, we had over 100 kids participating every year. We went from being bankrupt to where the pack used to own parents' money to it had a nice little reserve, had all kinds of equipment, and we had more activities in our unit than any other pack in the district. So I had really turned it around. But it was an unusual experience because I was not an outdoors person, and I was not expecting to be a leader. I thought I was just signing my kid up for something easy, and here I was off and running, just like the leader I am in the businesses.
That's quite funny. In fact, as you started that, but I'll step aside from that, from my insight for a moment. But I'll tell you one thing. I don't know if you could hear it in your own voice, Howard, but as you started to share that story, you got more and more animated. You were obviously very pleased and proud of that achievement at some level, I think.
Well, you know, I was, and I'm going to tell for anybody who's listening to this, you don't understand what leadership is until you have to run something where you have no real authority over anyone. And the only way in which you can get anybody to do anything is because they want to, and you've inspired them to. And that was probably my toughest leader experience ever. And to have taken it from where it was to where it ended up, and actually I created a transition plan, so there was actually succession. So the unit continued to grow and thrive after I left. And to have done that and to see that in this type of environment is so different than in a business, but to have made that work, yeah, I was a little proud.
And actually, you pulled out the lesson that I was just going to reflect on about that, because do you know the writings of John Maxwell?
Actually, I'm certified John Maxwell trained.
Okay, and I'm going to teach our listeners something you know already. One of John's quotes is to say, if you want to see how good your leaders really are, get them to work in volunteer organizations, because he says that's one of the purest forms of leadership as well. And now, and that's funny. As soon as you say that, I can hear what we were talking about on the previous episode and what you're saying here. I can see that, you know, a lot of elements of what John teaches you actually live.
Correct.
So, okay, so when we were talking in the green room before we came on here, we said that we would have a look at some of the leadership lessons and some things that our listeners can think about companies that are doing well on paper, but don't necessarily have a great core. And that basically effectively puts a glass ceiling on their capabilities because they're not looking after their core. Do you want to explain to us a bit more your ideas on that, Howard?
Correct. So again, if you haven't heard the last
episode
show that we did, the last episode, we mentioned that I was a CPA, and one of the things that frustrated me in accounting, and by the way, I'm not really wired to be a CPA, although I did pass the CPA exam, was that a lot of the things that we do or don't do that really affects your numbers never shows up on your income statement. So when you're a really bad leader and people don't want to perform for you and they make a lot of mistakes because of it, when you don't get opportunities, when you lose customers, that stuff really doesn't show up on your P&L. And so one of the things that I've learned now working with hundreds of companies was the difference between the ones that really, really excelled and the ones that just did okay. And the difference really was what I would call the core. So the ones that really understood how to drive and inspire the employees around a purpose, but also build in a core set of values that they drove everybody around, but also used really, really good leadership skills and built out a good leadership team as their core. And that served as the foundation for everything else. And what I found with some of the other companies is they would follow good processes for recruiting. They would go through the planning processes. They would try accountability. They would even send their people to all kinds of development programs, but they weren't seeing near the success. And what I found was the difference between the healthiness of the leadership team and the leaders and how well they built out that core.
As someone who's experienced in going in and helping companies to do that, Howard, have you got a finely choose sense of companies that have got a healthy core and those that haven't?
Yes.
And what are the couple of indications that resonate with you when you start to work with companies like that?
Okay, so first of all, you have to understand what core values are. So core values are very much like parenting. So you have a few set of rules, not too many, because if you have too many, people can't remember them. You repeat yourself a lot, and then you resemble them yourself. So when I go into a company, I compare what they say their core values to what I see the leadership team resembling. If there's a big gap between those two, I know we have a problem. They're not really driving a core. And then the second thing is if they have a stated set of core values, what their stated core is, do they fire people because they don't live them? Do they really defend their core values, or are they just things that are written on a piece of paper? Because otherwise what happens is, by default, the organization creates itself and the core creates itself, and you wind up with this dissonance.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So when you walk into a company and you're starting to look at that integrity at the very core of that, do you find that sometimes organizations are built around a personality, the head guy, let's put it that way, or head girl, and the executive team are following them? Do you find that that is one of the warning signs for potentially the core's not where it should be?
Well, yes and no. So yes, there's a strong personality around the head person. Now again, we have to talk about the size companies. So I deal with everything from, small entity with only a few employees to over $1 billion in revenue. So we're talking about very, very different dynamics. But if we're talking about the small to middle market companies, clearly, it becomes a lot more prominent how that most senior person's personality influences the company becomes a lot more obvious and a lot easier to sway the boat. The challenge becomes many times, for example, I'll see core values written down on a piece of paper or up on the wall or on a website. But then if you really, and it doesn't take long, if you talk to that CEO, you watch them walk around for a little bit, you watch how they interact with their people, there's a disconnect between what's written on that website or in that handbook and what you just witnessed. And that then there becomes a problem, because then for those people, they're confused. What did you really mean? Did you really mean what you wrote up there or what you're behaving? And people will usually follow what they see. And on what they see, if there's a disconnect, they're mainly paying attention to the things that you don't want them to be paying attention to. Sometimes our weaknesses. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that we point out the few things of that most senior leader that are the things we want them to resemble, that senior leader actually resembles, and make sure they're replicating that. And then if there's anything that is incongruent with what we want in terms of behaviors, even that senior leader needs to be able to be called out.
Actually, that's brilliant, because what that says to me is this then applies to our listenership in terms of the people in Impact Nation. Wherever they are leading, they need to be very clear on their values, and they need to be congruent with their values, because people will see what you do. They won't see what you say, which, I mean, there's a million and one sayings around that one. But yes, that makes a lot of sense. So if you go into a company and they've got this incongruence going on, and they're willing to change and to grow into the right direction, what kind of things do you teach them? What kind of lessons do you ask them to pay attention to? What kind of activities do you ask them to start to take on board?
So there's several routines that we do. The first thing is we need to crystallize and clarify what the real values are, not the imagined. So typically, it's very rare that you'll achieve aspirational values. So we want to actually identify what the real core values are. Then the next thing we need to do is we need to what we call intentionally drive your culture, intentionally drive your core values. And you do that through routine, and you do that through what I was saying earlier about repeating yourself a lot. And you could do this through very simple mechanisms. So you have, the initial, we're going to communicate it to everybody. You should have it posted everywhere. But then you need to make sure that you're keeping it alive. And the way in which you keep it alive is, so a lot of my clients, every meeting that they have where there's, let's say 4 or more employees, they have to talk about at least one core value in that meeting. So they'll actually go around the room and they'll talk about how somebody lived that core value, or they'll give a legend story that really resembles how they want everybody to remember that core value. They'll test people. They'll go around and they'll do little testings to make sure that people can remember the core values, and they'll do little giveaways to make sure that people remember them. Whenever they give feedback to employees, whether it's positive or negative, we make it a routine that when you're giving that feedback, positive or negative, that you tie it to core values so they see why you're happy and not happy and how it ties back to this core. And then if you have people that are consistently not living them, you have to be willing to fire them, even if they're your top salesperson or not. And then we also do other programs like Employee of the Month awards or quarters where they're actually getting employees to start recognizing other employees for doing core values. So there's all types of programs like these where you can do it. Also, all of my clients do daily huddles. So if core values is a problem in those companies, we make sure that we talk about core values in every single daily huddle.
That's pretty pervasive. And if you start that kind of thinking and then that kind of habit modification, how long does it take between you starting that kind of work and you seeing obvious sustainable fruit from that kind of work?
Usually within the first 90 days, you see immediate results, because what will happen is the people that don't live those core values and you start holding them accountable to them usually get a lot of pressure, and the programs that we put in place actually require that management take action. So they're put on performance plans if they're not living them, and they're actually either encouraged to step out or they're encouraged to step up. So within that first 90 days, you're going to see immediate results. And it's obviously tied to performance. And just to add another side note, whenever we set up the quarterly meetings with the executive team actually reviews every one of their direct reports. And we encourage this to do this all the way down throughout the organization. It doesn't matter the size. You should be evaluating your employees in terms of whether or not they're an A player or not. An A player is defined in two ways. Number one is how well do they live your core values, and second, how productive they are. They need to be both. And so you do a measurement in terms of how consistent they live each core value. And that way it keeps it top of mind, and you're watching to see, is anybody moving on or off path? And you're very quickly bringing them back on path when you see them moving off path. And you also get feedback from the other leadership team members if they see something that maybe the manager's not seeing. So typically with my clients, we see a very quick change of events. But for the long term, where it becomes really, really deep-rooted, where it just becomes really DNA of the company, it usually takes, it's a good 6 to 12 months before all of a sudden you would never know that we ever had to do anything.
Okay, so I'm thinking about, I'm a project manager at my core, and I've managed some very big, hairy, going down the hill fast projects. And what I've noticed is sometimes when I want to change the fundamentals of a project, effectively I lose time, I lose momentum while I turn the ship round, if you will. And then once I've got it going, I can pick up momentum. And then once I hit the inflection point, I then thoroughly increase, but I do lose productivity. And I'm interested, when you do this, do you find that companies have to be willing for 90 to 180 days to have some loss of momentum and performance momentum? Or do you find that it's just naturally what ends up doing is they keep going and they actually start to resonate with each other and become far more productive and they don't lose the momentum?
So for this part of a project, I would disagree with you on that challenge. And the reason is, so think about this. If you have employees and they're not living your core values, that means there are management problems already. That means you're probably regularly talking about them in management meetings on a daily basis. So if you don't address it, you're already losing a lot of productivity. The second part of this is they're also losing productivity within work groups because, again, this is core. This is supposed to be DNA. And so when you have different factions of people acting differently, the company is already not moving at the right level of productivity. So the more and more people you get acting more consistently with your DNA, the less management problems you have, and the more the company can move at full stride. So you're already starting at bottom because you already have a percentage of your employees not living your core values, and you're moving forward. So with every employee that you move in line with your core values, you're actually increasing productivity, and you're not going to have employees move out of line with your core values that are already living your core values. So why would you lose momentum?
That's brilliant. I mean, no, I just wanted to ask, I mean, that makes sense to me theoretically, but I wanted to know if with boots on the ground, that's what happened, or as you change the communication cadence and as people get to understand that this is the new way we're going to communicate and why, that you get a hiatus, if you will. But it sounds like it's a bit of a no-brainer for companies to adopt this kind of approach.
Let me give you a real great story. So, real good core value story for everybody to walk away with, and this will resonate with you. So I took over, I was essentially the equivalent of a chief operating officer of a floral importer in Miami, and my job was to help turn them around. And one of the areas we were having problems with is sales stopped growing for the first time in the history of this company. And I started looking out on the sales floor. And we had, and this is a number of years ago, so forgive me if I don't remember the exact number of salespeople, but I think we had about 15. And we had one guy on the sales floor, and he was supposedly our top producer. And the main reason he was the top producer is he had our largest account that represented 10% of our sales. We were about a $25 million company at the time. And so that was a pretty big account. And he was actually the third employee that was hired by this company from when it was existed. Now, this employee was a nightmare. He didn't resemble any of the core values that were reflected on the list, one of them being respect, another one excellence, and we had a couple other core values. And every day I had another employee problem with him. Touching the ladies, he wouldn't show up for our daily huddles where we'd start out the day with the sales team. He wouldn't participate in the training. It was just a nightmare. And what was interesting was I also watched his other behaviors. Because of his behaviors, the people around him could not perform. They were distracted by him. They were unhappy. And I kept trying to deal with it, and I could not get him to conform with what we needed him to conform with. So I had to go to the owners and say, listen, your number one supposable producer, he needs to go. Now, you got to imagine I was new. I was there less than 90 days. They were not too excited about this idea. And to make matters worse, he was the godfather of one of the owner's sons. So I was not a popular person. But I was certain that core values was so important, and I could not get this person to live them. And he was creating so many management nightmares for me, I couldn't get anything else done. So eventually I persuaded the ownership team to fire him. Within 3 days, I had several employees come up to me and say thank you. And their thank you was because they had left the competitors because of our reputation, of our culture. And they were glad to see that we actually lived out what we promised in terms of culture. The other thing that happened immediately was that team around this person automatically started producing a lot more immediately. Now, the other thing that was also amazing was I took a relative rookie. So this guy was a 17 to 20-year employee, and I put a 1-year employee on his book of business, which also the owners weren't too excited about. So about 3 weeks after we made this move, the president of the company gets a phone call, and it's from that largest client. Now, you got to imagine what's going through the mind of this president is now I've got Howard. Boy, Howard made a huge mistake. I can't believe we got rid of our top salesperson. They're calling to complain. And as soon as that owner of our client gets on the phone with the president of our company, the first words out of his mouth was, it was about time. He said it was about time. And he says, we stopped ordering more from you because we couldn't stand that guy, but we didn't know what to do because we knew how close you were with him, and we knew he had been here from the beginning. We didn't know what to do. And he said, now that guy's gone, we're ready to order more. That's how important it is to live your core values.
Boy, that's an amazingly powerful story. I mean, everybody intuitively knows that you're right, but it's great when you have stories with that amount of power. And it's a very visceral story as well. So thank you very much, Howard. Well, Howard, like the last episode, we are way over time. So I want to thank you on behalf of myself. I've got a page and a half of notes, and I want to thank you on behalf of our listeners. This was another great episode.
My pleasure.
Oh, and Howard, what I'll do is I'll reach out to you on email and ask you if you can give me some links that our listeners, if they're interested in finding out more about you and what you do, that they can reach out to you directly. Would that be okay?
Oh, that would be awesome.
Okay, thank you, Howard. And until next week, Impact Nation, this is Tony Sherman wishing you a great week and enjoy this episode. I know I did. Bye for now.
That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. Now go and apply these few gems. Make the wisdom you have heard your own. If you want to be part of our launch success, then please go to impactteamsradio.com/love and tell the world. If you want more and never want to miss a beat, please go to impactteamsradio.com/subscribe. If you have 3 minutes, we would love to see a positive review on iTunes. And until next time, remember to act on what you've learned, and you'll be ahead of most of the world. Impact Teams Radio.